Thank you. And thank you too to Professor Lombard for a very interesting and illuminating lecture, and thanks for the invite here, Paul. And I have to say, it's really beautiful to be in Pilgrim, a very beautiful church and a place of prayer, and lovely to be with the community and Jana and Sandy. Although I regularly reflect on the Hebrew Scriptures, I have no formal academic competence in interpreting. So this evening I'll leave that element aside, that element of Professor Lombard's paper aside, and thankfully Liz is here to keep us company. What a good thing. But I've reflected a great deal, as you just heard from Sandy, on religion's place in the contemporary West, and especially on how the church might best engage society today, so it's to fulfill its mission of proclaiming the gospel. As a consequence, I will respond to the set of issues raised at the end of Professor Lombard's paper, where he states, and this is my paraphrase, that modern Western democracies have an impulse by means of law and state to put religion on the margins of public life. I want to propose that this marginalisation, although present to different degrees in many Western polities, occurs most obviously in the Republic of France, wedded to its concept, as Professor Lombard mentioned, of laïcité, excluding religion to a large degree, or to quite some degree at least, from public life. I want to draw out some of the limitations of this stance, but at the same time consider the challenges that a religious perspective addresses to any view of secularism. I'm assuming here that none of us want to return to the medieval Christendom worldview, that worldview that ran really between the middle of the 11th century and the end of the 18th, if indeed a return to such a worldview were ever possible. Of course, the Christendom worldview made an immense contribution to Western culture, and it was imbued with an incarnational spirituality. Nonetheless, it carried within it limitations that I believe neither the churches nor society in general should desire to live with ever again. Western culture today is flushed with a plurality of religious and moral perspectives. Not only does the diversity of perspectives continue to expand, but you and I are able to resonate with people whose perspectives differ markedly from our own, and even feel moved to respect those whose stances we don't fully understand. The basic political principles of liberal democracies govern our common life together in the light of such diversity. Yet although these principles have garnered a great deal of acceptance, and again, I'm assuming that none of us wish to return to a medieval worldview, nonetheless, as Professor Lombard indicates, significant challenges remain. The fundamental challenge, I think, is the equitable management of religious and moral diversity. States face this challenge in various ways, dependent on social and ethical conflicts, dependent on the social and ethical conflicts experienced and the state's institutional arrangements. Examples of this diversity abound, but perhaps the most persistent and prominent being the debate in France between 1989 and 2004 over whether Muslim girls may wear the hijab or headscarf while attending state schools. The implications and the reverberations of that debate have reverberated since that time and continue to, but nonetheless the period between 1989 and 2004 was the time when that debate was being had. And in the heat of the debate, in July 2003, President Chirac appointed the Stasi Commission to report on issues associated with laïcité or secularism. Of the Commission's many recommendations, and I think there were about 22, only one related to clothing. But the public debate continued to focus on headscarves. In identifying what lay behind this protracted tension, US anthropologist John Bowen observes that many French citizens saw their conception of the Republic threatened. Their anxieties, he says, and I quote him, their anxieties went beyond racism and xenophobia, although clearly these were present, went beyond that to fears that the emergence of a public Islam challenges the particular institutions that guarantee life together in the Republic, a public space from which ethnic, religious and other characteristics are erased. It's really reflecting Christo's argument. The debate over headscarves was strongly influenced by its cultural context, by France's distinctive view of laïcité. In other nations, the management of moral and religious diversity has also proved challenging. Strong public debate was provoked by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams's lecture to the Royal Courts of Justice in February 2008. Williams discussed how the British legal system could accommodate religiously plural claims, and he raised the example of Sharia law. You might remember the response here, even in Australia, and that response centred on the relationship between Sharia and British law. In other nations, in Canada, the United States, Germany, the Netherlands, Turkey and India, these have all struggled to manage competing conceptions of the world and of the good in recent years. It's not possible, clearly, in 15 minutes, to consider any of those examples in detail. I just want to pursue briefly the more general question of how liberal regimes can best approach the task of managing religious and moral pluralism. This has been a central concern of contemporary political philosophy, recently discussed in terms of the nature of secularism. That's basically the framework in which it's discussed and widely discussed these days. The work of a seminal thinker, John Rawls, provides a good framework within which to examine this question. And clearly here I'm not talking about his early major work, A Theory of Justice, which gives quite a different picture, but rather his late work and the book entitled Political Liberalism, where he develops a view of liberal regimes that has gained significant agreement among political theorists. He assumes that citizens of contemporary democracies hold a plurality of reasonable yet incompatible moral and religious perspectives, or what he calls, quote, comprehensive doctrines. He argues that liberal states must be neutral towards citizens' comprehensive doctrines. Of course, liberal states like our own are built upon fundamental values which states, watch Australia for example, states are not neutral about, and those being human rights, equality, the rule of law and democracy. Yet those values allow citizens to engage with one another from their own diverse stances. So Rawls envisages liberal regimes forming what he calls an overlapping consensus of reasonable comprehensive doctrines. That is, he sees humanists and Muslims and Christians and others agreeing on the fundamental values of the state, human rights, equality, the rule of law, democracy, and each from their own particular perspective and with their own unique reasons. So the fundamental values are shared, the justifying reasons are not. In Rawls's late view, therefore, states cannot themselves adopt any comprehensive doctrine, whether religious or secular. States must remain neutral toward all comprehensive doctrines. Let's need a little civil. What happens then when tensions arise in liberal regimes on account of the plurality of moral and religious perspectives? How can these tensions be managed? And we see them increasingly, even in Australia. The common response to these questions turns to institutional arrangements. That is, a solution is enforced by ensuring, quote, separation of church and state, or the neutrality of the state toward religions, or some other such formula. These are precisely the principles implemented in the French headscarves case. However, While institutional arrangements ensuring the neutrality of the state in these matters will be indispensable, two Canadian political theorists, Jocelyn McClure, and you won't be surprised, Charles Taylor, have recently argued that a response solely in these terms often works against the equality of moral and religious perspectives. In their French headscarves case, enforcing the separation of church and state means that Muslim girls can't give expression to a practice which they see as integral to their faith. McClure and Taylor argue then that the reality of secularism, the state's neutrality toward a plurality of moral and religious perspectives, is better understood and can be better practiced if we see it in terms of two major principles and two operative modes. So two major principles, or what they're going to call moral principles, and two operative modes. So the major principles are moral principles, and they are equality of respect and freedom of conscience. These uphold the equal dignity of all citizens and each person's sovereignty in his or her decisions of conscience. The two operative modes, the separation of church and state and the neutrality of the state towards religions, are indispensable institutional means of implementing the moral principles. Because citizens possess an inalienable dignity, the state must not identify itself with any particular worldview. It must both separate itself from all worldviews and not be biased against them. Approaching the tensions of secularism from the perspective of both moral and institutional principles allows a greater possibility of resolution than could be achieved by turning solely to the institutional principles. That's the heart of McClure and Taylor's argument. Distinguishing clearly between the ends, the moral principles, and their operative modes allows citizens to name what is accurately name what is at stake. For example, a Muslim teacher's desire to wear a headscarf in school could be seen as an expression of her freedom of conscience. That is an expression of one of the moral principles. Her wearing such clothing has been regarded in some countries as compromising the neutrality of public schools, a facet of one of the institutional principles. So there's a clash here between secularism's moral principles and its operative modes. McClure and Taylor's articulation of secularism doesn't automatically resolve the dilemma, but it does express more accurately what is at stake, and it opens a path to better understanding, and in that way offers a better chance of resolution. This view of secularism recognises the burden borne by Muslim teachers wishing to wear headscarves and makes room for a discussion about whether such a garment really does compromise the neutrality of the state. The complexity of the issue is well illustrated by the fact that two other democracies, Germany and England, have resolved the issue of Muslim teachers wearing headscarves in opposite ways, in very different ways. Finally, let me conclude then with a few words about church and state, the church in a secular age. I'm proposing that we come to a view of secularism as the best way of... I am proposing that we come to a view of secularism as the best way of democratic states dealing with the plurality of religious and moral comprehensive doctrines within their borders. Professor Lombard points out that some views of secularism aim to expel religion from public life, and that is clearly true, especially in the case of the Republic of France, but it's not universally so. And I believe that most democratic societies are struggling with the equitable management of religious and moral diversity, as I've already said. In my view, taking account of McClure and Taylor's major principles and operative modes can aid our discernment. This raises a further question for people like many of us here tonight who find the deepest truth of their lives in the gospel of Jesus Christ. How can the churches be faithful to proclaiming the gospel in our secular pluralist context? A key document from my own Catholic tradition that addresses this question is the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, 1962-65, is Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, or its Latin title Gaudium et Spes, published in 1965. Clearly, in the remaining time, I can't spell out this document's view of the church-world relationship in any detail, yet it sees the task of proclamation in dialogical terms, ones which I believe engage well with our context. From this perspective, while treasuring the scriptures and the church's tradition, the bearer of the gospel remains profoundly open to any dialogical partners or governments wanting to understand them, her, or him on their own terms. The act of proclamation, then, is an offer to another or to a society to consider whether the language of faith makes best sense of human existence and our common life. Thank you.